All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today to celebrate the anniversary of the Achieving a Better Life Experience Act, better known as the ABLE Act. This federal law created tax advantage savings and investment accounts for the disability community. My name is John Finch. I serve as the director of Florida's ABLE program, better known as ABLE United, and I will be the host for today's webinar. As a reminder, you can input your questions in the Zoom control panel, and we'll do our best to address them as we go throughout the presentation and at the end. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel in the coming days. Today, we're joined by one of the key players who was instrumental in getting this historical piece of legislation passed, Congressman Ander Crenshaw. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing great. Good to be with you.
Thank you so much. So in honor of the 10-year anniversary of the Federal ABLE Act, we're taking a step back to kind of talk about that whole process, how it became to life, and the importance of self-advocacy for the disability community. To provide some context, prior to launching of the ABLE Act, individuals with disabilities were restricted on how much money they could save while maintaining their eligibility for public benefit programs like supplemental security income and Medicaid. But through a group of parents with children with disabilities, they advocated for multiple years, as you'll hear, to finally get a final piece of legislation introduced in the 113th Congress. This was a bipartisan, bicameral set of congressional champions who made this possible. And this included Senators Robert Casey Jr., Richard Burr, Representatives Ander Crenshaw, Chris Van Hollen, Kathy McMorris Rogers, and Pete Sessions. And so it did take over a decade, but it finally passed the House in December of 2014. And then 2 weeks later, it passed the U.S. Senate as part of the tax extenders package. And then finally, it reached President Obama's desk on December 19th, 2014. And he signed it to make this dream a reality for many individuals and families with disabilities. Now, each state had to pass their own ABLE legislation. So here in Florida, we passed the Florida ABLE Act in 2015, which launched our program in July of 2016. We serve as a direct support organization under the Florida Prepaid College Board. And since then, we've helped over 12,000 Floridians with disabilities and their families save over $100 million in the ABLE program. Well, let's kind of take us back a step, Congressman Crenshaw. Let's dive into kind of the history. So taking us back 10, almost 20 years now, how did you first hear about what is now known as the ABLE Act, and what made you drawn to go and work with those families?
Well, thank you, John, and thanks for having me on today. It's interesting because this is the way legislation is really supposed to work. It's back, I went to Congress in about 2000, and I'd say about 2005, I had some friends that had a son that has Down syndrome. His name was Gary, and we nicknamed the Gare Bear. He just loved to be around people and became a good friend. And I could yo-yo, and I would do things with the yo-yo, and he thought that was great. And then so I started thinking to myself, I wonder if there's something we can do to help people like Gary that have disabilities, whether it's Down syndrome, autism, or any other type of disability. And at the same time, my chief of staff in Washington had been meeting with some friends of his that lived in his neighborhood that also were involved in the disability community. And they were together trying to think, is there something we might be able to do at the congressional level to make their life better? And so my thought was that when I looked at things we might do, you could save money after you put money in a tax-free savings account, and you could save money to retire. They call that a 401k. And then they have something called the 529, where you can put money aside. It grows tax-free as long as you use it for educational purposes. And to go to college and things like that. And then finally, I realized that there was something called the health savings accounts, which also allowed individuals to put money aside, and it would grow on a tax-free basis as long as they used those proceeds, for health care. And I said, I wonder if we could create some sort of entity that would allow individuals with disabilities, maybe they could save money on a tax-free basis. And then as long as they use those for some of the necessities that they might need that other people might not even be aware of. And so that's how the ABLE Act was created. And actually, in 2007, we passed legislation. We met with some of the different interest groups and say, here's what we're trying to do. And of course, everything gets complicated when you talk to Congress and they say, well, how do we define disability? Is that according to Social Security, or is there another definition? And then we decided, what are we going to call this? Well, we didn't call it ABLE to start with. We tried to come up with some acronym. And I think to start with, it didn't really make much sense. It was like accounts for help to people and this and that. And it didn't have a very good ABLE. So we got started and people got interested. And then we started having an event every year that people would come to Washington, and if they were involved in the disability community, and they could go around and talk to their senator or their House member. So 2007, and when the session ends, your legislation ends. And so we filed it again 2 years later, 2009, and got a little more interest. And then 2011, we filed it again. And more people started getting interested. And that's when Senator Casey from Pennsylvania agreed to file similar legislation in the United States Senate. And so he was our original sponsor down that way. And then everywhere the folks would come to talk to their member, I would see people on the House floor and they say, hey, I just want you to know I live in New Jersey, and I had one of my constituents came to see me and said, you ought to look at this ABLE Act. By now, we had named it ABLE. That was, I think, in 2011. So we could say Achieving a Better Life Experience. The people could understand that's what ABLE stands for. And they'd say, we signed, just want you to know, I signed your bill today. And more House members were signing on as co-sponsors. And then in the Senate, Senator Casey, we would meet about maybe once a month, and he'd say more and more people are signing on. And when people would come up, we would get together and you'd meet some wonderful people that have the kind of disabilities that we're talking about. And then we realized that even though you could save money on a tax-free basis, if you're already receiving some benefits from the federal government, you couldn't have more. At the time, if you had more than $2,000 in your own name, well, then you would lose your federal benefits. Mm-hmm. So we said, well, we got to solve that problem. So we, as part of the IRS, part of the income tax code, we said that those dollars, the ABLE account money, wouldn't count against your $2,000 you could have, because you'd meet individuals and they say, Josh, my uncle gave me $2,000 as a birthday present, but I couldn't accept it because it would make me lose some of the benefits. So we solved that problem. So it's getting better and better. And about this time, when we would meet, I would encourage everyone. I said, please just go out, tell them you live in their district, tell them a little bit about the ABLE Act, tell them you'd like to have them sign on as a co-sponsor. And it grew and it grew and it grew. And then 2013, that was the year that it was going to pass during that session, 2014. And as John mentioned to you all, actually in 2014, we actually had a signing ceremony at the White House and had about 100 people there. Some of the members of the Senate and the House that had been helpful along the way, we were all together. It was just a wonderful time. Vice President Biden came in and said a few words. So it was a great day. But here's one of the last things I'll have to tell you all. When we were creating these accounts, well, we didn't know how much it was going to cost. And this is interesting. The Internal Revenue Service says that if you give something as a tax-free benefit, then you got to replace the money that we're losing because of the tax exempt status, and you got to find the money to replace it. Well, when the first time they did a score of that, they just assumed that anybody with a disability, anytime, anywhere, was going to be able to save money. And they said, well, this is going to cost like, $50 billion of lost tax revenues. And we said, well, I don't think we can find $50 billion. So we had to limit, initially, say, this is a disability, and we outlined those. It has to occur before you become 26 years old. And you can only have up to $100,000 in that account. And by the way, when you make contributions to those accounts, they're subject to the same gift limitations we have in the IRS code. So you could give up to $18,000, but when it got over $100,000, there were some implications there. Bottom line, it's been up and running. And when it passed, it was the most bicameral, the most bipartisan. Just about everybody in the United States Senate had signed on the bill. An overwhelming majority of people in the House had signed on, and it was a wonderful day. For me, it was probably, I would say, one of the most important things that I ever did in the years that I was in Congress. So that's how it got started, John. And here we are 10 years later. And as you pointed out, we can talk about the IRS because they had to help set it up. And that was an interesting story in itself. But that's kind of how it got started. And again, it's the way it ought to happen when people get together and they say, hey, there's a problem in our society. Let's figure out a way to solve it. And it started at a coffee table, in outside of Washington, D.C. It started with my friendship with Gary, and this is what's resulted. So you find a need, you solve a problem, and it's a hand up, not a handout. It's a way to help people help themselves. John, that's it.
Yeah, that's great history. I mean, as you mentioned before, the idea of the importance of storytelling, of reaching out to your representative, your senator, letting them know of an issue, and especially when you kind of get that grassroots movement with parents and families. Can you share a little bit of importance of why that's important for individuals when they see a need or an issue, reaching out to their legislators?
Exactly. And telling the story. That's what I'd always encourage the families. Tell the member, the senator, the House member, you live in their district. You're their representative. This is something that's important to us. And I would say, please don't ever underestimate the fact that you've come all the way to Washington and you're sitting down in front of your member and saying, I'd like you to really take a look at this. And I think that had a tremendous impact. And everywhere I'd go, you'd meet people in the disability community, and they had just such wonderful spirits, wonderful attitudes. And when they would talk and say, this is something that we really ought to do, again, it just grew and grew. And that's why it's the law today.
That's great. Yeah. And I think it's important, just as when I go out and I talk to individuals about this program, how important it is to have individuals around me that actually themselves have an ABLE account, or maybe their child has an ABLE account, because they're truly telling the story that I can of the impact that has on their family. So let's go back a moment. You talked a little about working with the IRS, right? So I was at a recent event, actually, and IRS had a booth, and I felt bad because no one was going to their table. And so I went and said hi, and actually we had a mutual connection there. But so how is it working with IRS and trying to get this on board with them? Because, 529A, which is the legislation that kind of added this new section to the IRS code. Can you tell us what that process looks like?
Well, that's very interesting, John, because anytime you deal with the tax code, it's very complicated. There's a committee in the House called Ways and Means, and in the Senate it's called Finance, and they have to pass the legislation that deals with anything that touches the IRS. And as I mentioned, when you actually make something tax exempt, then that takes money out of the Treasury, and the IRS sometimes think they have rights to all the money, and they don't like people to keep it on a tax exempt basis. And parenthetically, sometimes when Congress will pass a big tax relief plan, they don't have to replace the money with something else. The argument is, and I think it's true in part, if you lower people's taxes, then maybe the revenue will increase because people will spend money, et cetera, et cetera. But when you're talking about a specific project like we had, you had to go find the money. And at the end of the day, it was going to cost the Treasury $2 billion. And the good news is one of my best friends in the House was a fellow named Dave Camp, who really is partly to give credit because he was in chair of this committee. And I said, Dave, I said, we've got to find $2 billion to replace the $2 billion that the people in charge say that the Treasury is going to lose. And he said, just give me a minute or two. And he had two staff members. I'll have to tell you, he called one of them the brain and one of them the mouth. And he said, I'm going to talk to the brain and talk to the mouth and tell him somehow we need to find $2 billion of money that will be available to replace the lost revenue. And sure enough, he did. And that's why at the end of the day, it was really in 2014, it was the end of the session. There was a tax bill there that he made it part of his big tax bill, found the money to replace it. And then it passed both houses and the president signed it. But one of the things, John, that is very interesting, because once you pass legislation, then particularly as it deals with the tax code, you have to get the IRS to write the rules and regulations about this new program called ABLE. And at the time, the commissioner of the IRS had become a friend of mine in an unusual way, because I had been critical of the IRS, some of the things they had been doing, and I was charged with overseeing their budget and their operations. And so while I was critical from time to time, the commissioner at that time realized how important ABLE was to me, that I'd worked on that for almost 10 years. And once the legislation passed, I told him, I said, I know that it takes time and energy, but you appreciate where I'm coming from, and I'd love to see you make that a priority. Well, literally within 1.5 years, the ABLE Act in Florida was up and running. And I can tell you that most people would agree that anytime you want to write rules and regulations that the Internal Revenue is going to write, then it's going to be 3 to 5 years minimum before all that happens. So we were very fortunate, based on that relationship, that he made it a priority and it made it up and running. And that's why we were able to start when we did. And that's why it's impacted so many people, not only in Florida, but all across the country. John,
Yes.
I tell you, I think every state implemented the ABLE Act in their own way. And Florida has been one of the leaders. And so I'm awful proud of what we did in Florida and all the work that went on and all the people that helped.
Yeah, some great numbers. So I think just this past quarter, nationally, there's 47 state programs, including DC. Wisconsin is going to be launching early next year. And so that will leave about 3 states that are still in the process of getting it passed. But combined, I think we're close to 200,000 ABLE accounts nationwide, with about $1.8 billion. So it's just amazing about, what has happened over the last 10 years. And what's unique is that the legislation has actually grown. So the ABLE Act kind of was the beginning, but shortly after, there's been several enhancements to the ABLE legislation. Because I see a question that came in that talks about, what about the ABLE Age Adjustment Act? But what was unique is when it first passed, it kind of limited individuals to enrolling in their state's ABLE program. That was amended to allow individuals to enroll in any program that offers nationwide enrollment. So that kind of opened it up for those individuals in states that weren't ready to launch their ABLE program. Also, we think about some provisions that allow individuals to roll over their 529 college savings accounts over to ABLE, as well as to be able to make the ABLE account almost like a retirement account, take advantage of a saver's tax credit, as well as contribute above that annual limit. But even more recently was the ABLE Age Adjustment Act. And so I think part of the discussion, another question I would like to ask you is, when this passed, it limited individuals that had to have a diagnosis prior to age 26. And that was kind of, I believe, something that came along due to getting the cost down. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. Because if it had been open-ended, it would have cost a whole lot more money. And that just at the time was not something that we could do. So we had to limit it. And that's why we said you have to have this determination made by the time you're 26 years old. And once you do that, then something called the Congressional Budget Office, they score these kind of programs and say, we think this is what it's going to cost. And we said that's reasonable. We hate to have to limit it, but we do. And now, as John mentioned, this Age Adjustment Act, the new age is 46. So you can find that you have a disability that we're talking about up until the age of 46. And what I understand that has added about 6 million people that are potential folks that can take advantage of this situation where they can save money on a tax-free basis as long as they use those proceeds for things that they need, whether it's medicine, whether it's transportation, whatever. And that's been an expansion of that. And obviously, I'd love to see it expanded even further. But a lot of things in life, you got to start somewhere. And we knew that's where we could start. We could accomplish that. And it's grown, as John mentioned. And I think it will continue to benefit an awful lot of people in our country.
Yeah, that's a good point. So that adjustment comes into play in almost about a year now in 2026. It will
Starts
launch.
January 1 of 2025.
2026.
2026.
Yeah, and so that's going to be amazing because it's going to, for us here in Florida and just nationwide, it's going to double the amount of adults who will be eligible for this. So it's just finding those individuals and letting them know that, hey, this is a great way to put your money in and have tax-free earnings. So question came here is, what is the Enable Act and how will it impact critical federal tax advantages? So as I mentioned, there were several kind of enhancements to the ABLE Act. Part of those enhancements had a sunset provision. So basically that means, hey, after a certain time period, those provisions are going to go away unless Congress makes them permanent. And so just recently on the House or the Senate side, they passed what they call the Enable Act that would make those those provisions specifically as it relates to or college savings to ABLE rollovers, the ability to take advantage of the savers tax credit, those provisions would now be reenacted and solidified. So that's pretty excited. And here's a
One
question.
thing too, John,
Yeah.
let me just, since we're doing this, and I think a lot of people, this will kind of bring attention to the fact that ABLE Act exists and hopefully they'll take advantage of it. But I wanted to let you may know this, but in Washington, I think it's on December the 4th, there's going to be a giant celebration in the United States House where they will do what you're doing here and have a program that will just celebrate 10 years of ABLE Act. And I was invited to be part of that. Some of the people, in fact, there was a picture that they sent out that shows 4 or 5 of us that were involved in the original bill, sitting in the White House with all our friends around us. And when the president signed the bill, and that's going to be an interesting time. I'm not going to be able to go to Washington to do that, but some of the members that are still there, it's going to be a wonderful time. John, you might even be going, but it's going to be.
Yeah, I wish. No, I know. Actually, we have a couple people that represent Able United going. So Debbie Revels outside of it in your area.
Great. She was very involved.
Yeah, she was very involved. She called me up and she'll be attending on our behalf. So no, it's going to be an exciting event. I know several of our counterparts in other states that will be attending. So I'm just throw this open-ended question here. What do you see over the next 10 years? If you could envision looking into the future where ABLE accounts are, what is your hope for the next 10 years as it relates to ABLE accounts?
Well, I hope more and more people will become aware of this. As you know, John, it's something that probably most people don't understand because they're not in the situation of having a disability and then maybe have some federal assistance, and know there is something that the private sector brings out that you can actually save the money and you can save it tax-free, and it's impacting a lot of people. And I know, as I've watched and you've watched over the 10 years, more and more people have become aware, more and more people have answered the questions, does this make sense for me? And it's getting easier to actually open an account. The regulations that the IRS set up, you don't have to go get a lot of rigmarole. You just need to, if you have a disability and it qualifies, you can open that account, begin to save money on a tax-free basis. So I just hope it will continue to grow, because I know, as you pointed out, an awful lot of people's lives have been touched by this. And I think it will continue to grow, and maybe we can even expand it more. But it's something that I always said, look, we help a lot of people by doing this, whether it's retirement, whether it's college, whether it's health. Why don't we try and help some people that really they have some needs that so many of us don't even realize are out there. But as they understand what's available, they're taking advantage of it, and it's changing their lives. And so I just hope it'll continue to grow.
Yeah, and I think so too. And I think this Able Adjustment Act comes into play, and then we're reaching a lot more adults that might not have known or even qualified. So, I'm thinking of disabled vets. I'm thinking of a lot of mental health diagnoses that occur later in life. And really, my hope, I know, just thinking the next 10 years, and something I'm proactively working on, is really trying to get this in to employers. Because, if I just think about, you mentioned health savings accounts, no one knew about those until employers started adding it to their benefit packages. And so hopefully one day we'll be part of that, that annual enrollment process that individuals go through for their health insurance, to say, hey, by the way, there's this ABLE account that you can utilize. But with that, I want to just have some final remarks. Andrew, any final remarks before we wrap it up today?
Not for me, other than I'm just thankful for what that you're doing in making people aware of this, and hope the interest grows and grows, because from time to time I'll meet people and I'll say, have you heard about the ABLE Act? And sometimes they say, yeah, I've already got an account. Or sometimes they say, no. Well, I said, let me tell you, there's something that's available that can be really helpful. So I'm just encouraged that more and more people are finding out about it. And I know that's what you're doing every day, John. So thank you for that. And let's just keep moving forward.
Appreciate it. Well, knowledge is power. We appreciate all of you taking time out today to hear this very important discussion topic. Pay attention to our website as we put more information out there about other pieces of legislation that impact ABLE and how you might be able to advocate for it. With that, if you didn't get your question answered, feel free to reach out to us at info@ableunited.com, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. Again, thank you all for joining us, and until next time, take care.